All right, it's 5 minutes past 3 o'clock, so let's start. Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Goos. I'm the Deputy Director of the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute in Florence, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 5th lockdown webinar in our series of lockdown webinars here at the MPC. I am standing in for the MPC Director, Andrew Geddes, who was supposed to chair today's seminar, but he unfortunately fell ill, so he can't chair, and I'm here instead. Today's topic is public attitudes to migration in times of COVID. How are they changing or not? Of course, we have some reasons to believe that in some ways attitudes towards migration and migrants might become more hostile, but perhaps migrants are also working in essential sectors and services, so there might also be other dimensions of attitudes that might be changing in a more positive way. And we are here to discuss this today with 3 excellent speakers. I will just introduce them very briefly in the order that they will be speaking. First up, we have Miriam Juan Torres Gonzalez, who's a senior researcher at More in Common. And More in Common, Miriam is based in London, and More in Common works on initiatives to address the drivers of societal fracturing and polarization, and works toward more inclusive and resilient societies. Second, we'll have James Dennison, who is a part-time professor here at the MPC, where he heads up our Observatory of Public Attitudes toward Migration. And the third speaker, who is not with us yet, but who we hope will join us a little bit later, is Mohamed Adaw. He is an Al Jazeera correspondent based in Doha, and Mohamed has a lot of experience reporting from across Africa. So we are also covering the issue from various different geographic perspectives. For those of you who are here for the first time, the way this works is that we'll have the 3 presentations, 10 minutes for each speaker, and we will then take questions. If you have a question, please type the questions in the chat box on the YouTube channel, and please let us know who the question is for. After the presentations are done, I will try to organize and collect the questions and assign them across the different speakers. So if you have a question, please type the question in the chat box on the YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Miriam for the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm going to share my screen now to share the presentation. But first of all, I would like to start by thanking the Migration Policy Center for inviting us to present, and for everyone that's attending. I'm aware that these are tough times for everyone, and I hope that everyone is doing well and that everyone's keeping healthy and safe. The goal of my presentation will be to walk us through a little bit of what we've seen in public opinion towards migration over the past few years, how we are applying what we call the core beliefs model, and what COVID means for the changes that we are observing and what we can expect. And to share a little bit of the background for our organization, our mission is to understand the forces driving us apart, to find common ground and help to bring people together to tackle our shared challenges. Our work actually started by looking at attitudes towards immigration, refugees, and identity. So we weren't looking at those attitudes in isolation, but actually at how a combination of factors leads to people see migration in a particular way. And we did that through a variety of segmentation studies across Europe and the United States, which I will be sharing briefly. We are a nonprofit. We operate mainly in France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the US, although we have done research in other European countries as well. And as Martin was saying, we focus now a lot on increased polarization, social fracturing, and extremism. Our work is built on an evidence base of 10 national studies of people's values, identity, and outlook. And we touch a lot on social psychology, which I'll be sharing today as well. And these studies integrate key insights from people's worldviews and psychology, combining it with political science as well, and other social sciences, to understand and have a more comprehensive view of people's attitudes, but also what lies beneath them. And we apply those insights through more than 50 partnerships with institutions from across our 4 main countries, including civil society, advocacy, media, multilaterals, etc. So what we've done. We've done population segmentation based on values and identity. And what we've seen is that actually doing that kind of segmentation is a stronger predictor than just looking at attitudes towards migration through the lens of demographics or through general statements. So something that we've really pushed ourselves towards is to go beyond binary statements or like a superficial understanding of what's the percentage of people who support immigration in one country or who believe that the impact is positive and negative. And something that we've done is identify the different segments within the population. And it's true that there's usually a core group of supporters who is very committed to immigration, and a core group of opponents who usually or often has a nativist attitudes towards immigration. But what we see is actually that in most societies, there are a variety of groups who have complex, nuanced, and sometimes ambiguous or conflicting views that are driven by different things. I will not go in depth into any of the countries because we unfortunately don't have time. But just to get that understanding, that notion that there are those differences. So it's not a 50-50 world. There's always, as I was saying, those two groups that tend to be more vocal and tend to be showcased in media. But in reality, there's also these other segments. There's generally 2 or 3 distinctive conflicted middle groups, and some are more open to persuasion than others. And when we see data, for example, 60% of people say the impact of immigration is positive, 40% say it's negative. When we look at other questions, we see that those groups that are on each side of the divide, so to speak, they're not homogeneous. They shift, and there's also a framing and strategy that we can use to actually understand or appeal to them better. The other thing is that the characteristic of each of the middle segments really differ by country. So for example, in Italy, we identified a group that was the Catholic humanitarians who are driven in their humanitarianism and their openness to immigration by their actually very religious and somewhat conservative views. This is not a group that we observed in other places. But the other issue as well is that the conflicted middle groups are vulnerable to us versus them narratives. There are people who have conflicted views and concerns, and those concerns have often been answered through simplistic narratives by anti-migrant populist segments of the population. They've been really good at appealing at their core beliefs and their anxieties and building narratives that, as we've seen over the past few years, have actually gained more traction than they were gaining perhaps before. So the conversation on immigration over the past few years hasn't been about immigration alone. For many, it's connected to identity and about a broken system rigged for the rich and influential. And I think this is relevant to think about what COVID will mean for this conversation as well. Because while there's some room for optimism, for example, there's in some places, for example, in the United Kingdom, a lot of people who work in the National Health Service or in essential services are actually people who are migrants. And that's actually opening up a conversation about how we value these people. It's also likely that in an economic depression, we will have scarcity of resources, and it's possible to build an argument around that as well, that harnesses that us versus them narrative or dialogue. So this is something that we need to bear in mind when analyzing shifts and changes based on as a result of COVID. But in order to understand those views better, we're using the insights from social psychology, as they can help explain some of the underlying factors for high proportion of mixed views groups. And understanding those core beliefs and values, which I will touch on now briefly, will also, I think, provide us a little bit of guidance on how attitudes are going to evolve in the next few months, and also how they can be tapped or utilized by a variety of actors. What we've done at More in Common is actually develop a model that touches on what I've been referring to as the core beliefs driving polarization. So what we try to measure is group identity and tribalism, who we identify with, who is our in-group, what our views of the out-groups, who is perceived to be the out-group. people's tendencies to, or how people evaluate threats, so what's their perceived threat or threat perception, authoritarianism and parenting style. We've used moral foundations from Jonathan Haidt, and then personal agency and responsibility. So whether people believe that people's outcomes in life are a result of their personal agency or actually of the environment, and that nuanced view that some groups have. And what we've done is actually test how that works when it relates to immigration. And this is likely to still remain true regardless of changes in COVID, but understanding those links actually provides some guidance about how this can evolve. So we did this study in the United States, and we collected data on immigration topics. So it's a variety of things: contribution of immigrants, support for the border wall, DACA, support for refugee sponsorship. And we tried to look at those different elements of people's psychology and actually how they correlate to a variety of attitudes towards immigration. And what we saw is that across the board on a variety of issues, it was views of authority, respect for the rule of law, and the authority moral foundations that some of you may be familiar with, that actually was strongly correlated towards attitudes to immigration. Knowing this, we ran cross-tabulation analysis to understand those different aspects of people's psychology that are related to how people view a variety of issues on immigration. And we developed a variety of messages that appealed to the most relevant core beliefs. So what we observed as well is that a lot of the messages, a lot of the narratives that are pro-immigrant actually rely on a set of values, a set of appeals to a small set of moral foundations and core beliefs. So we try to build messages that touch on those liberal, more open values, messages that tap on the other side of the spectrum, and then balanced messages that incorporate references to, for example, providing, caring for immigrants, but also combine it with appeals to authority, respect for the law, etc. And what we saw is that actually those messages were far more effective at reaching a wider audience. And I think that that's something that we need to reflect on. Knowing what we know about people's core beliefs and psychology, how can we expect the far right to utilize those aspects of people's psychology and link it to COVID? And there's already evidence based on research that's being done, for example, by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue or the Center for Countering Digital Hate here in the United Kingdom, that shows us how the far right currently is actually linking COVID to migrants. There's a big race component as well. So they're utilizing this moment to actually heighten the most heinous racist arguments out there. So we know that the far right is doing that. So I think that that's something that we need to bear in mind as well when we think about what shifts and what narrative other actors are putting out there that might be trying to counter that strategy. And knowing, for example, that people's threat perceptions also influence their views on immigration, like we need to think about what COVID does to people's perceived sense of threat in this current moment. So it seems that we are at a particularly vulnerable time, although there's also some room for optimism. What I would say as well, though, is that we really need to not fall prey to false binaries, to think whether everybody's going to be supportive because of migrant workers, for example, or everyone's going to be against. I think it's going to be very, very complex as it's been so far. And we need to develop a sophisticated understanding of the different narratives and how it will appeal to different segments of society. I'll skip this because of time, but what I would say as well is that we are already observing some shifts in data trends based on COVID and the impact it's having. Some of them, as I was saying, leaves room for optimism. So for example, when it comes to feelings of social solidarity, we are seeing significant shifts. So we've asked in the US and in the UK, for example, whether we're all in it together, or it's everyone from themselves. And there's been a significant increase in people who now believe that we're all in it together, that this is a shared threat that we're facing. And it's been even more significant in the United Kingdom after years of vitriol and divides over Brexit. In March, we asked the question of it's everyone for themselves. We look after each other, and we saw 24%. We asked the same question in May, and it's actually 61%. So a very big shift in perception of social solidarity. But it could go in another way as well, depending on what we see over the next few months. And what we see as well is that right now there's overwhelming public support for fast-tracking overseas trained doctors to help fight COVID-19, for example. So we see that in some areas of immigration policy, there also seems to be a shift or increasing support, which I think is very interesting. But we need to think about what are those policies that are more likely to be gaining support and traction, and which ones aren't, because I don't think we will see the same trend or direction in attitudes towards a variety of things. Similarly, in the UK, a lot of support as well to allow doctors and nurses trained in foreign countries to practice medicine in the UK and in the US. But in the same vein, like, we're doing some qualitative work as well, where we're trying to unpack people's attitudes towards migration and another thing as well. And while there might be more support for some particular policies, particularly that target migrants that are already present in the country, everyone is now wearing COVID glasses or COVID lens. And we see these issues through the COVID lens as well. And there's a lot of people who are now seeing immigration and refugees through the lens of we need to shut borders because what we need to do is contain this virus. So these are some quotes from qualitative work that we've done in the past few weeks. So COVID really isn't an issue of immigration as much as people are trying to make it out to be. If this is still going on, in 6 months or a year, then yes, then it becomes an immigration issue. Right now, it is we need to keep our country safe issue. All countries need to do that. Or it's not safe for anyone to leave their country right now, but as far as letting new people in yet, no. So it's gonna be going in different directions for different issues. I think this is what we can expect. But I know that James is also gonna tell us a lot of what we can expect in shifts in attitudes towards immigration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for this very concise and great overview. I think it'll serve as a very good introduction and basis of the discussion today. We'll continue right away with James Denison.
Sorry, let me just try and share the screen here. So thank you very much for that presentation, Miriam. That was really fantastic. I hope that mine isn't going to appear too elementary after that, because you provided really fantastic detail there. And also thank you to everyone else who's tuned in today to listen to this webinar. I think it's a really interesting topic. And it's still really an evolving issue, of course. The data on the relationship between COVID-19 and immigration is still very early days, so there's plenty of room for discussion here. I'm going to talk about 3 potential effects of COVID-19 on immigration. The first is the public opinion of immigration, the second is the politics of immigration, and finally, migration policies, how we expect those 2 to lead to different policies. So how is COVID-19 likely to affect attitudes to migration? I realize Miriam has already covered this a lot, but I think there are essentially 2 theories. On the one hand, we can expect from a lot of the political psychology literature that certain predispositions that are associated with anti-immigration sentiment might be somehow triggered by the current crisis. So one theory I use a lot is Schwartz's theory of basic human values. These are people's basic motivational goals in life, what they want from life. And of the 10, 3 are particularly associated with anti-immigration sentiment, valuing tradition, valuing conformity, and valuing security. And security, for me, could be one that becomes associated with COVID-19 and thus triggers anti-immigration, some kind of anti-immigration backlash, because that's also to do with personal safety, not just external security. The second one, which Miriam's already talked about, is in terms of moral foundations. So a lot of moral foundation theory work has looked at how preferences for authority and in-group loyalty are associated with negativity towards immigration, and those could plausibly be triggered by the COVID-19 outbreak. On the other hand, as Martin mentioned at the start, we could expect to see an increase in pro-immigration attitudes because immigrants have arguably, in some countries, become more visible during the crisis. So as Martin said, this is particularly in so-called essential industries, essential sectors, and particularly healthcare and agriculture, which haven't, of course, been able to stop throughout the lockdown. So that might lead to greater pro-immigration sentiments. The way to really understand better what is likely to happen is to understand what has been happening to attitudes to immigration in recent years in Europe and why, and then we can predict what is likely to happen in the future. So the most authoritative pan-European surveys, such as the European Social Survey, show that attitudes to pretty much all types of immigration have become more positive in the last decade and the last 2 decades indeed, with the exception of 1 or 2 countries. So this is also true for a range of attitudinal types, including preferences to types of immigration, the perceived effects of migration, and the desired migration policy. And as well as the European Social Survey, which I'll overview on the next slide, the Eurobarometer also comes to a similar conclusion when it's asked since 2014, so more recently, please tell me which of the following statements evokes a positive or negative feeling for you, immigration of people from outside the EU or from other EU member states. So let's just start by looking at how the European Social Survey data has changed over time. So here we have, 22 European countries, and we see the distribution of attitudes to migration from negative on the left to positive on the right at 2 time periods. The full line, the dark line, is 2002, and the dotted line is 2018. And we can see, if you just look at Sweden, for example, we can see not much change over the course of 14 years in terms of the distribution of the population, in terms of attitudes to migration. But we do see slightly greater positivity in the case of Sweden, that's the top left. Then if we look at Norway, we see considerably greater positivity, all the way through Germany, Ireland, Switzerland, Spain, the UK, etc., all displaying greater positivity. So the question here, which I should have said before, this is the distribution here comes from a factor variable, which is basically comprising a number of different types of attitudes to migration. So the perceived effect on the economy, the perceived effect on your culture, how many migrants you think should be allowed into your country, that kind of thing. The point is, essentially, we see throughout the 14 years great positivity. And importantly, this is over the course of the migration crisis. So this is after the migration crisis 2018. The only exceptions are towards the bottom. So the last one, Hungary, Czechia, Lithuania, Cyprus, and Bulgaria, we only have 1 wave. But Austria and even Italy, we see greater negativity. Besides those, Italy, Austria, Czechia, and Hungary, all the others display greater positivity over time. More recently, a different data source, so cross-validating that finding of greater positivity over time, this is the Eurobarometer. So since 2014, we see greater positivity in the dark line. That's net positivity to immigration from other EU member states. So net positivity means the percentage responding that they feel positively about it, minus the percentage responding that they feel negatively about it. The point is, in absolutely every country, I think, Romania in the bottom right might be an exception, but in every EU member state, we see greater positivity over time. So basically, the changes are massive, but it is considerable given it's such a short amount of time. It's only 5 years here, and we're seeing greater positivity to immigration from other EU member states in every country. Less negative, but still improving, is attitudes to immigration from outside the EU. So that's the grey line. So in pretty much every member state, we see there's a fixed difference, a constant between the net positivity to immigration from other EU member states and from outside the EU. There's a few exceptions, such as the UK on the left there, where the two are basically treated the same. But essentially, in every case, we see greater positivity towards immigration. Now, for a few reasons, some of which Miriam has already discussed, this is a bit surprising. And the main one from a political science perspective is that fundamental political attitudes tend to be fairly stable across the life course. So we basically expect people, once they reach 30 or so, to not change their mind very much about those really deep-seated political attitudes. Are you left-wing? Are you right-wing? Are you pro-immigration? Are you anti-immigration? Those basically predispositions are fairly fixed. And at the aggregate level, i.e. in terms of countries, they should be fairly stable over time as well, for reasons I won't go into now, just to save a bit of time. What change there is usually results from generational change. So that means that people who are socialized in different circumstances, in the case of immigration, generally more heterogeneous societies in Europe, have different attitudes as they come into the electorate, whereas those older people who are socialized in their early years in different circumstances, often more homogeneous societies, they die off. So basically the nature of the population changes over time. However, this is unlikely to sufficiently explain the rapid positivity towards immigration in Europe, and this gives us clues about COVID-19. So it's essentially, the change is too rapid to just be old people dying and new people and young people coming through. There's a few alternative reasons that could explain such a rapid increase in positivity. The first is that immigration has been such a prominent issue in recent years that it's led to there being more information in the public sphere, in the public realm, which means that people basically become more informed about the topic and essentially become more in favor of immigration, or at least they become more in favor of immigration in total. So they become, they might say, okay, I still think there are certain bad things about immigration, but I now see that in total, it's a good thing. Overall, it's a good thing. The second potential reason for the rapid change could be effective migration communication. It could be that organizations such as More in Common, organizations which I've worked for as well, have just done a pretty good job at convincing people that actually immigration is a pretty good thing, and that's having a positive impact on people's attitudes. Finally, and one that I think is quite a convincing theory, is that as the radical right have become more prominent, it's created a gulf between their often quite extreme rhetoric and policies and everyone else. So everyone who isn't part of the 10, 15, at most 20% of the population who vote radical right, everyone else sees that this other, the radical right, and they say, okay, well, I'm not so anti-immigration as them, so I must be reason to be pro-migration, actually, after all. So it could be a sort of a partisan party identity effect as well. How does this affect what we might expect to happen because of COVID-19? I think that the prominence of migration, and this is what I'm going to talk about as I finish the presentation now, the prominence of migration in the public debate is likely to decline, just as it did in 2008 and especially after 2010 for 2 or 3 years. It was far less prominent than it had been before, and it became afterwards, again, during the migration crisis. What might actually happen is that as the issue becomes less prominent, all eyes turn to the economy, towards unemployment, towards health. There becomes less information in the public sphere again, and their attitudes will stop changing so rapidly. So that there'll be a sort of slowdown in that change, or even just a stabilization, you could say, or even they could backtrack a bit and become more negative again. Also, because there are these competing theories which I outlined at the start in terms of political psychology versus more information during this period of the lockdown, those could cancel each other out. We call that cross pressures in attitudes and political behavior. That usually leads to no change when there are cross pressures. So I have one more, actually. Okay, so I'll skip over this, but why has radical right voting increased in recent years despite more positive attitudes to immigration? The answer is really on this slide. This is the percentage of people who say that immigration is one of the two most important issues affecting their country. I've divided all the EU countries by region, and in the dark black line, you see the percentage saying that immigration is one of the most important issues affecting my country. If we all look at the top left, you can just see Austria. So Austria is really a classic case in terms of immigration salience in the last few years. It was a fairly important issue, about 15 to 20% prior to the 2015, as you can see at the very bottom of the years. Prior to the 2015, the so-called migration crisis, immigration was a secondary issue in Austrian politics. It mattered, but it didn't dominate. So about 15 to 20% said it was one of the most important. In 2015, we see the sudden spike. What happens then? That means that people who are already anti-immigration, which maybe is half the population, or maybe let's say a third of the population, because there is that middle, which Miriam talked about, with varying degrees of anti-immigration sentiment, they suddenly stop voting according to economic attitudes, social attitudes, health attitudes, blah, blah, blah. And instead they start voting according to their immigration attitudes, those predispositions I talked about at the start. What's actually happened since 2015 is that that's steadily declined. In Austria, a classic case here, it's still higher than it was pre-migration crisis, but it's significantly lower than it was in 2015, 2016. So that's basically meant that since 2016 or so, voting for the radical right in most European countries has declined. It suddenly went up 2015, 2016. Of course, we know about Brexit. Of course, we know about Donald Trump in the US. Of course, we know about lots of other elections around that time. But since then, the radical right has done a bit worse. In 2018, 2019, and recently in elections. I guess I'm going to have to stop in just a minute. Okay, let me just quickly wrap up. All this means is we should expect health, in the dotted line here, which is already rising in a lot of countries in terms of importance, to become more important. Same for unemployment, which had been declining, and immigration to become a less important issue, and the radical right to suffer. What that means is that looks like a good thing, but it might lead to policy drift, which is that with no one caring about migration in politics, no leaders caring about migration, actually migration policy doesn't change, and it drifts from its original position from a time when attitudes were very negative, and there isn't the political capital to change it anymore. Sorry for running over, I do apologize for that. Thank you very much.
Excellent, James. Thank you very much. And I'm now delighted to welcome our third speaker, Mohammed Adaw. I'm delighted you could make it. Mohammed is with Al Jazeera based in Doha, and he has extensive experience reporting from across Africa. So over to you, Mohammed. You've got about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry for the delay in joining. Now, this is a very interesting topic, especially now that we are facing the crisis of COVID-19. But across, Europe and also in Africa and the Middle East, I have covered the issue of migration extensively. And from my experience in places like Turkey, Greece, Niger, people crossing the Sahara Desert to Libya, and then eventually the Mediterranean Sea to try and reach Europe. One thing that I have noted is that migration, people going through these very dangerous routes, of course, I'm talking about those that some refer to as illegal migrants. There's the lack of this universal emotion called hope that is driving people to go and take these journeys. And then again, from the start of time, migration has been a very necessary thing, something of course curtailed by the lockdowns and the restrictions on movement imposed by more than 180 countries across the world. COVID-19 has proven migration quite difficult. But again, is this going to be a flicker of hope in for those seeking policy changes for COVID-19 for migration? Yes, it could be. There is hope that this could be the dawn of a new era in terms of policy changes, because already we are seeing countries, of course, imposing restrictions to try and control the spread of the virus. But again, we've seen instances where countries are have made during this period the laws on migration are also giving asylum a bit simpler for people. Portugal, for example, giving asylum to all those who are in the system, the release of people who've been in detention centers, and people who've been detained after failing to get asylum in Belgium and other places. So migration is a very necessary thing for the whole world, and over time people have been migrating because of the flow of people from places where they have had wars like Syria and other places. It at one time became unfashionable. And I remember being in Greece at the border between Macedonia and Idomeni in 2015, the wave of migrants from places like Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq being pushed back and being beaten with batons by police from Macedonia. Of course, the Greeks were much more helpful, people being brought food and other things. And it was for me really seeing humanity relating to each other, and people who were fleeing wars and troubles back home being helped by the local Greek population despite all the economical problems they've been going through. And again, that was that was really a point where migration was really something that was being looked down upon because of the wave of people who were trying to get into Europe. So, but again, it's a very vital thing for the world, migration, despite all the negativity around it, because as I was saying, COVID-19 could be a source of hope for this situation when it comes to migration, because what we have is a situation where it has brought about, to many people, this crisis is an eye-opener to how useful migrant workers are to the economies of Western countries, because most of the frontline workers we are seeing tackling coronavirus and the spread of it are migrants. 8 of the doctors who died in London in the first few weeks of the corona outbreak were migrants. Most of the nurses we see, many of the nurses we see in the United States and then Europe, nurses, they're migrants. So increasingly we are seeing people realizing that yes, immigration might be necessary, and no doubt this corona outbreak, once it gets out of the way, hopefully, it would lead to policy changes, might lead to policy, definitely lead to policy changes.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I think this was really helpful to provide an overview of what's going on in different areas as well. And I'm sure in the discussion we'll get back to the specific role of the media as well in potentially shaping some of these debates and narratives. What I will do now is remind everybody that if you want to ask a question to the speakers, please use the chat box on the YouTube channel to formulate your question, and please also let us know who the question is for. We've got about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and I'm hoping to get in at least 2 rounds of questions for our 3 speakers. And if I could just ask for relatively brief answers as well, so we can get in as many questions as possible. We'll start with, we'll go in the order of the speakers in today's presentations. Miriam, Maria had a question about the role of the parenting style as a potential driver of migration. And there was also a question from Florence in Germany about the role or the potential role of the rise in social media in shaping some of these attitudes and narratives. And maybe James and Mohammed can also speak to the social media element. A second question for James comes from Helen Dempster in the UK. And her question is about what messaging would be helpful if you wanted to make the case for immigration based on the argument that migrants are needed in essential services. So I suppose it's a question about the implication of the research for best types of communication. Mohammed, in addition to commenting on the role of social media, I was wondering whether you could also say a few things about your impression of how media have covered these events and different types of narratives that are emerging when it comes to the pandemic and migrants in particular. But we'll start with Maria.
Yeah, and thanks, Maria, for your question. And I think that's actually relevant. It could be quite confusing presented in isolation. But essentially, what the parenting questions are is a set of questions that were developed in social psychology to measure authoritarian underlying tendencies. So that's not to say that people with a particular parenting style or preferences are authoritarian, but we know that cognitively we are all different. And some people need more assurance of homogeneity. Some people have a greater need for oneness and sameness. They're equipped that way, and they have more difficulty with change. And that's one of the things that we're measuring to understand how that drives attitudes to a variety of issues. And the best way of measuring those underlying authoritarian tendencies is actually through questions on parenting style, then tap on preference for discipline over creativity and other things as well. So they've been developed in social psychology. And on the question of social media, I think that's a very pertinent question as well, and something that we keep looking at. There's several things to say here as well. On the one hand, we need to remember that a lot of studies reveal, including ours, for example, in the United States, that the majority of people are not on social media, and that people who are on social media tend to be those who have stronger views. Those that are manifesting them tend to be those who are most dogmatic or have stronger views in a spectrum. But they do dominate the conversation on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and that also pervades and translates into more coverage into mainstream media as well. So those extreme voices are being elevated. And I think that could be something that's also contributing to a heightened debate, or has contributed in the past to a heightened debate on immigration and other issues, or the salience of the issue. But I think that James was pointing to changes in salience of the immigration issue. This is something we've seen in the UK a lot, where the UK has been a country that has had more positive views overall of immigration in other European countries, and there was a spike in salience and in negativity during the Brexit years or the years before Brexit. But then we've seen actually a shift again in salience. It's not that such a salient issue anymore, and actually like the trend is towards more positivity. So there's a lot of complex elements to this and the role that social media plays as well.
Thank you, Miriam. James?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just start with answering Helen's question. Look, Helen and I know each other, so let me also say hello to Helen. This wasn't a planted question, by the way, as far as I'm aware. So in terms of the best types of communications based on these findings, well, as Helen already knows, I mean, a lot of the communication stuff is built on psychology, and migration communication is no different. So when it comes to, I spoke earlier about basic human values. I hate to go back to it again because I think Helen's going to be so bored of it, but perhaps other listeners will be interested. The key values which predict anti-immigration sentiments are conformity, tradition, and security. Using Schwartz's schema, there are lots of other schemas, lots of other schemes of values, which I won't go into now. But the idea in a paper I've recently written is that the most effective way to communicate is to use your opposition's values. So and that speaks to those in the middle quite a lot. So people in the middle tend to have kind of balanced value sets. They see the value of security and conformity as well as universalism, for example. So how could migration communication in a post-COVID world speak to those more typically associated with anti-immigration sentiment values, conformity, security? Well, how might we highlight the importance of migration for security, for safety and security? I think it's actually pretty simple right now. If anything, it's on a plate at the moment for migration campaigners, in the sense that we have the health workers, as well as all sorts of other essential services as well, that are literally keeping us safe at the moment. Disproportionately, those are migrants, or if not, they are also disproportionately in the UK, I can say at least, descendants of migrants. So the benefits of migration for someone who cares a lot about security and safety are quite clear right now. So, I mean, that would be where I would start. Tradition, conformity, these other ideas which Miriam has highlighted, including heights, moral foundations, but there are lots of others out there. The logic is the same. I won't go into those values right now, but I would start really just highlighting the contribution they make to safety and security.
Thank you, James. Mohammed?
Well, we've been seeing a lot of negativity as well during this time, being put on social media and also mainstream media. And we have a situation where people are still talking ill of migration, and people with very strong views on the arrivals, the boats also that the migrants are on. And it's sad when the land of departure, but also the land of arrival becomes unsafe for migrants. And we've seen very strong views on Facebook, Twitter, and all that, particularly on the Malta-Italian, the Maltese and Italian governments, refusing those boats carrying the migrants across the Mediterranean. So a lot of, I must say, negativity going on. And so we're seeing a situation where there is an attempt to reinforce the hostile environment in the Mediterranean.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all your questions. And I apologize if I can't get them all in. We have time for a second round of questions. So Miriam, I'll start with you again. We've had a couple of questions that relate to the framing of immigration in terms of the deservingness and usefulness of migrants. Princell in South Africa points out that attitudes toward doctors during the pandemic have been quite positive. So obviously attitudes toward particular types of highly skilled migrants are positive, but Keith wonders whether this discourse about essential workers and how migrants are needed, whether there isn't a danger that you increasingly frame this whole debate in terms of the usefulness of migrants to host societies. James, for you, we've had Friedrich and Maria ask similar questions about the role of high unemployment that we are likely to see in the coming months and years in influencing attitudes. And we've also had a related question from Alberto, who asks about whether the far right won't exploit any health concerns that people might have with regard to immigration. So it's kind of the questions about the potentially more negative views because of high unemployment and health concerns. And for Mohammed, there were questions about attitudes in different places, and a question about whether cities might develop different types of attitudes or changes in attitudes, and maybe perhaps whether frontier towns that receive a lot of migrants might have quite different attitudes. So could you comment on the diversity of views that people might have even within the same country, depending on where people are and what that might mean? Okay, we'll start with Miriam again.
Thank you. And I guess several points. Of course, there's always a balance to find when framing those messages or arguments. And of course, like we know that we are at a particular time where threat perception is being activated, where there's a lot of arguments around security. James was mentioning the Schwartz value scheme, and it aligns very much with our work as well. So I think that it's a matter of seeing like how we can connect some of the issues that we're seeing and to those values, as James was pointing out. But of course, like keeping that nuance and understanding in mind, and also what the opposition is doing, because like we are not doing messaging, we are not doing framing in a void. It's happening in a wider context, and it's a wider context of another set of actors, actually very well coordinated, like putting out content and like a particular narrative, and it comes from the dark web, but also like political leaders, as we see in the United States and Spain. Some the far right as well, it's getting really active in that sense. So I think that it needs to be, we need to be carefully thinking about what are those messages that we can build that appeal to those value sets and beliefs that touch on authority and on tradition, on conformity, but also in a way that doesn't reduce people to the other. And I think that that's something that we need to think about as well, like whether highlighting, like whether we are on a journey here, like if we are highlighting the usefulness of essential workers, and it's not just doctors and nurses, like we're also seeing with supermarket workers, which is one of the most lauded and applauded groups now in the United States because of COVID, for example. And whether we can take people on a journey of seeing an us versus them dynamic, of seeing migrants as an other, taking them towards seeing them as a positive other, and then from that positive other towards an us, towards like part of the in-group as well. So I think that there needs to be a strategy that is attached to particular messages and being aware of those nuances and dangers too. And I think that Lillian had a question as well, touching on attitudes towards refugees in refugee camps. And I wanted to touch on that because something that we saw in Greece is that there was actually less variance of attitudes, and it was in general a society that had more opposition to migrants and refugees. And it was interesting to see the insights coming out of the quantitative data, but then paired with the qualitative data, because when we had the conversation with a lot of people in that conflicted middle group that didn't necessarily have the same nativist views, they may have opposed refugees, but often they actually had a very strong sense of empathy. And what they were talking about is we oppose the refugee camps because there's overcrowding, because there's those are no conditions for anyone to live in, because it's not any better. Because like, of course, like if I were migrating, and a lot of them refer to migrant experience to the US, like if you're in an overcrowded space with no resources, you're ultimately going to resort to violence. And I would do that as well. So there's that understanding. And also a lot of people in Greece were mentioning government failure, and that they didn't believe that they could accept refugees or migrants because like the government was useless. The government wasn't providing. So this is just to say that while all of the data points are very useful, and we need coupling them with the qualitative work and actually unpacking the thought process of people is really important, because it shows that public opinion is way more nuanced and complex, and we can use that to our advantage.
Thank you, Miriam. James?
Yeah, I mean, I really will skip over the questions that Miriam answered because it was such a comprehensive and good answer. So I'll just go straight to Friedrich and Maria on the effects of unemployment on the radical right. It depends, but judging on what's happened thus far in the last decade and more, we should expect, somewhat counterintuitively, that more unemployment will be bad for the radical right. Some examples of that in the recent past, where the radical right has performed worse: Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Greece is a mixed bag, Italy until quite recently, although the leg has taken off in the last 3 or 4 years. Again, those were all countries where unemployment was a very high salience issue. And that meant that the key protest party was radical left. So Syriza, Podemos, the Bloco de Esquerda, I think it's pronounced in Portugal, a few different Irish parties could take that mantle, Movimento 5 Stelle as well in Italy. So my initial guess would be that unemployment would be bad for the radical right because they've become one-trick ponies on immigration. But we don't know. We're living in different times now. Many of those radical left parties are discredited, and we do have the emergence in Spain, particularly in Italy, even more so, and even in Portugal now of a radical right party. So we don't completely know, but I wouldn't guess that unemployment will be good for the radical right. On health, though, but which I guess we don't know, but will be salient for less time, but still for a while, at least until there's a vaccine. Health is uncharted territory. That's been rising in salience for quite a few years now. And we don't really know yet. No one's claimed ownership of that. The radical right have immigration. Traditionally, conservative parties have tax, but no one has health. So the big battle for social democrats, the big battle for pretty much every party family in Europe right now is who has the best answer on health. It could be the radical right. The radical right could win that battle, but that's really they already won on immigration. That's really the game in town right now. Which party family has the best answers on health? Maybe the radical right will win that. I don't know. We'll see.
Thank you, James. Mohammed?
Well, attitudes will continue to be as mixed as ever. You mentioned the issue of the points of arrival where people are arriving, and it's always been somewhat empathetic to the refugees and the migrants who arrive in places like Lampedusa, the Greek islands, of course, from Turkey, and other places. And also places like the entry points for the different countries. What we are seeing is the attitudes in this moment of crisis and the relevance and importance of the rules. It's been largely one of empathy, but also we know that in these places where the refugees are first arriving, the populations have been helping the people with things like clothes and food and stuff like that. And this might continue because the people know that the destination of these migrants is not to their place, to their towns and cities, but it is rather the big cities where the people are headed. I have been to some of these places where the refugees are trying to, they're trying to cross, for example, from Calais in France, where they are trying to cross the channel towards the UK, which is a preferred destination. The attitude there essentially was one of some of the people were sympathetic to the migrants, trying to help them, but others were like, they've given our town a bad name and things like that. But when you go to the big cities, there was, some sort of indifference and some sort of negativity towards the migration, the whole issue of migration, and this might continue. So it's going to be as mixed bag as it's been from the onset.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Thank you for all your questions. We've got just under 10 more minutes. So I will ask one general final question for all the speakers, which kind of returns to where we started. I mean, for obvious reasons, we don't have any strong research results yet, obviously, for how COVID will affect attitudes. But in today's discussion, we went through a range of reasons that might give hints of how these effects might work out. But my question is this: do you expect the impact of COVID to be a temporary one or to be a longer term one potentially? I mean, in other words, for example, are any potential positive effects of the celebration of essential migrant workers likely to be temporary or more longer term? So as the pandemic subsides, as we all hope it will, what's going to happen to attitudes? So if I could just ask for brief responses to this general question, please. We'll start with Miriam again.
It's a very big question, and I'll try to be brief. But just to say as well that we're actually doing a pan-European and US study right now, trying to assess those shifts and attitudes towards a variety of things, including immigration. So hopefully we'll get some results on that in the next month or so. But what I wanted to say is that there's a lot of interesting work that's been done on the impact of disasters and crises on people's attitudes and sentiments of social solidarity, for example. And there's a very good graph that I can't remember the name of right now, but I'd be happy to share in some other way if I can, that speaks about the increase in sense of social solidarity and gratefulness when there's a disaster that hits, but then a decrease as a result of resource scarcity, of difficulties that stem from that particular disaster or whatsoever. It comes from psychology, but I think that that's something that we can expect as well. I think that we are in a very volatile time, but I wouldn't want to remove the agency that we have on how things end up happening. I think that this is a time of change, but we actually can seize the moment and be deliberate and take action. And it will largely depend on whether we actually succeed, are careful, strategic about what we do, whether this goes in one or another direction. Obviously, there's a lot of unknown variables, but choosing to be optimistic here.
Thank you, Miriam. James?
Yes, so to me, I think it's definitely a critical juncture in European politics. It's likely to be. We don't really know how it will be yet. As I've already said, my closest suspicion for attitudes to migration is that they'll actually stabilize, because migration will go off the table, and that will be bad for the radical right. I think most interesting will be what will happen to migration policy. The European institutions, national governments have really, in vain a lot of the time, but at least tried to make big reforms to migration policy in the last few years. And I just wonder if that's going to basically hit a bit of a brick wall as people turn their resources elsewhere. And we might have this policy drift where there's this zombie policy from previous years, just from sometimes decades ago, just drags on because there just isn't the political capital to change it anymore. Who knows, though, would be my overriding sentiment.
Thank you, James. Mohammed?
Yeah, I'll regarding your question, I'll just speak about the situation in migrant camps where, the situation is really dramatic and the living conditions are really bad. People have been kept together in very congested conditions, and of course the different authorities are trying to create social distancing and do whatever they can help, but also that's been mainly hindered by the volunteers and the international organizations who've been trying to help the refugees, the migrants, keeping away during this time of crisis. So would this space created by the coronavirus situation, where people have had to have better conditions in terms of congestion, continue? Maybe not. If we keep on living with the virus, maybe yes. So I see a situation where things are going to improve because there will be the return of the volunteers if the coronavirus crisis fades or wanes. So it would be, once again, some sort of a blessing and also a curse all together.
Thank you, Mohammed. It's time to draw this session to a close. So we've covered quite a lot of ground. So thank you to the three speakers, Miriam, James, and Mohammed, for excellent contributions and for your answers to the questions. I'd like to thank our audience for asking these questions, and please keep watching this space. The Immigration Policy Center here at the European University Institute will organize more webinars on these issues, and I think there are 2 more planned for this month. So please check out our website and stay in touch. But for now, I wish you a good afternoon, stay safe, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.